Some heroes are made in recovery, not in costumes. When Robert Downey Jr. walked onto the Tonight Show stage with that charismatic presence and hard-earned wisdom that had made his comeback one of Hollywood's greatest redemption stories, nobody expected him to reveal the most vulnerable chapter of his ongoing mission. Jimmy Fallon had planned an entertaining interview about Robert's latest projects and his incredible journey from addiction to superstardom. The audience was ready for the wit and charm that always came with a Robert Downey Jr. appearance, but what Robert was about to confess would silence Studio 6B and prove that sometimes the most important battles happen not against CGI villains, but in rehab centers where teenagers fight for their lives, against demons that society pretends don't exist. The cameras were rolling, the audience already captivated by Robert's magnetic energy, and then he spoke 13 words that changed everything. I visit addicted kids because I know that specific hell and shame of rock bottom. What came next wasn't just television, it was a revelation about addiction, redemption, and the sacred responsibility of using your second chance to ensure that other souls drowning in the same darkness don't have to fight their way back alone. Robert Downey Jr. had always been known for his remarkable comeback from addiction and legal troubles. The actor who transformed personal destruction into professional triumph, who turned his darkest experiences into fuel for incredible performances. But what audiences didn't know was that Robert's understanding of addiction recovery had never stopped being personal, and that his success carried with it a crushing awareness of how many young people were currently trapped in the same cycle of drugs, shame, and despair that had nearly killed him. The Second Chance Heroes program had begun 9 years earlier, during a period when Robert was reflecting on his own recovery journey and feeling overwhelming guilt about his privileged path back from addiction. The realization that his fame and resources had provided him with recovery opportunities that were completely unavailable to most addicts, especially teenagers, had given him profound insight into how arbitrary recovery success could be. When I got clean, I had the best lawyers, the most expensive rehab centers, family support, and career incentives to stay sober, Robert later explained with obvious pain. But there are kids out there right now who are exactly where I was, desperate, ashamed, convinced they're worthless, and they don't have any of the advantages that saved my life. Teen addiction affects millions of young people annually, with many facing obstacles to recovery that include lack of insurance, family dysfunction, stigma, legal consequences, and limited access to age-appropriate treatment programs. These teenagers often cycle through emergency interventions, juvenile detention, and inadequate social services without receiving the intensive, personalized support that successful recovery requires. These kids are dealing with the same demons I fought, but they're doing it alone without resources, often while their families are either enabling them or completely giving up on them, Robert said with emotion. They're written off as hopeless cases before they're even 18 years old, and that's exactly how I felt during my worst periods. Robert's first encounter with a severely addicted teenager had been through a court-mandated community service program where he met 16-year-old Marcus, who had been arrested for drug possession and was facing adult charges that could destroy his future before he had a chance to recover. Marcus was exactly where I had been, convinced that addiction made him fundamentally broken, that he deserved punishment instead of help, Robert remembered with heartbreak. He looked at me and said, "Easy for you to talk about recovery when you're Iron Man. Nobody's going to give a junkie kid like me a second chance." That conversation had revealed the devastating hopelessness that many addicted teenagers carry, not just the physical addiction and mental health issues, but the belief that their addiction had permanently destroyed their value as human beings. Marcus told me something that gutted me, Robert recalled with tears. He said he loved Iron Man because Tony Stark proved that broken people could become heroes, but he didn't think that applied to real life. He thought movie redemption was fantasy that didn't exist for actual addicts. Working with addiction specialists who focused on adolescent treatment, Robert had developed an approach that provided intensive, personalized recovery support specifically designed for teenagers whose addiction had been complicated by trauma, family dysfunction, legal problems, or mental health issues. These aren't just addiction counseling sessions, Robert emphasized. These are comprehensive life reconstruction programs. We address not just the drugs and alcohol, but the underlying trauma, the family dynamics, the legal issues, the education gaps, the self-worth destruction that addiction causes in developing minds. Over 9 years, Robert's Second Chance Heroes program had worked with 112 teenagers whose addiction had reached crisis levels, kids who had overdosed, been arrested, dropped out of school, or been rejected by traditional treatment programs for being too difficult or unmotivated. I worked with this 17-year-old girl named Emma who had been using heroin for 2 years, Robert remembered with tenderness. Emma had survived 3 overdoses and had been written off by multiple treatment programs because she kept relapsing. Her family had basically given up on her. The breakthrough with Emma had come when Robert shared details of his own relapses and arrests, helping Emma understand that recovery was a process, not a single event, and that failure didn't mean she was hopeless. Emma had been carrying shame about her relapses that was actually keeping her stuck in addiction, Robert explained. When she learned that I had been arrested multiple times, had embarrassed myself publicly, had disappointed everyone who loved me, and still eventually got clean, she realized that her failures didn't define her future. The approach worked because it addressed the unique aspects of teen addiction, the way drugs interfere with brain development, the role of trauma in adolescent substance use, and the importance of rebuilding identity and self-worth during recovery. There was this 15-year-old boy named Alex, who had been drinking and using drugs since he was 12, Robert shared with emotion. Alex's addiction started after his father left the family, and he was using alcohol to numb feelings of abandonment and worthlessness. Alex's recovery had been particularly challenging because his addiction was deeply connected to unresolved trauma and family dysfunction that required intensive therapy alongside traditional addiction treatment. Alex told me that drugs were the only thing that made him feel normal, that without them he felt like he was drowning in feelings he couldn't handle. Robert said, "Through our work together, Alex learned that those feelings were actually normal responses to trauma, and that he could learn to process them without numbing them. The most profound transformations happen when teenagers realized that their addiction didn't make them fundamentally broken, but was actually an understandable response to pain that could be healed with proper support and treatment." Marcus is now 25 and works as a peer counselor at a teen addiction center, Robert said with obvious pride. He tells kids that if Iron Man can get clean, so can they. But more importantly, he shows them that real-life recovery is possible even without superhero resources. Several teenagers who had completed Robert's program had gone on to pursue careers in addiction counseling, social work, or peer support, using their lived experience to help other young people navigate recovery. Tonight's appearance on The Tonight Show was supposed to focus on Robert's latest film and his thoughts on playing complex characters. Jimmy had planned to discuss his approach to bringing depth to superhero roles. Maybe get him to share some behind-the-scenes stories, definitely tap into the inspiring energy of his personal comeback story. The interview had started with Robert's characteristic wit and charm. He had shared insights about his recent work, discussed his approach to character development, and demonstrated the sharp intelligence that had made him such a compelling screen presence. But when Jimmy asked about how Robert's own life experiences had influenced his understanding of redemption and second chances, and whether his recovery had taught him anything about helping others facing similar struggles, something shifted in his expression. The question had been meant to explore his artistic philosophy, but it had touched on something much more personal that Robert had been considering sharing publicly for the first time. You know, Jimmy, Robert said, his voice taking on unusual gravity, my recovery story gets talked about like this inspiring Hollywood comeback. But the reality is that I got clean because I had advantages: money, lawyers, career incentives that most addicts, especially teenagers, will never have. And that knowledge carries a responsibility. The audience grew quieter, sensing that Robert was moving into territory that was more serious than his usual reflections on personal growth and career resurrection. That sounds like you feel a real responsibility to help other people who are facing what you went through, Jimmy said, with genuine respect and curiosity. Robert was quiet for a moment, his characteristic confidence replaced by profound vulnerability. I do. And it comes from the guilt I carry about getting a second chance when so many people, especially kids, are trapped in the same hell I escaped, but without any of the resources that saved my life. The studio was completely focused on Robert's words now, the energy shifting from entertainment to something much more meaningful and raw. Robert, it sounds like you're working directly with young people who are struggling with addiction, Jimmy said softly. Robert's eyes filled with tears, a sight that was particularly powerful coming from someone known for his emotional control and professional polish. For 9 years, I've been working with addicted teenagers who are exactly where I was: desperate, ashamed, convinced they're worthless, kids whose society has written off as hopeless before they're even adults. The audience was completely silent now, witnessing a side of Robert Downey Jr. that transcended his celebrity, the raw empathy of someone who had transformed his own destruction into a mission to prevent others from drowning in the same darkness. Jimmy, can I tell you about something that's taught me what real heroism looks like? Robert asked, his voice growing stronger despite his tears. Please, Jimmy replied, clearly understanding that something profound was being shared. Robert took a deep breath and spoke directly to the camera with the authenticity that had made his comeback so meaningful. I work with severely addicted teenagers through my Second Chance Heroes program. 112 kids over 9 years who are fighting the same demons that nearly killed me, helping them understand that addiction doesn't make them broken, it makes them human. Jimmy's expression changed completely as he grasped what Robert was describing. You're personally mentoring teenagers through addiction recovery. I'm proving to kids who think they're worthless that addiction doesn't define your future, Robert replied with conviction. These teenagers are dealing with the same shame, the same despair, the same self-destruction I experienced, but they don't have to fight their way back alone. Tears were streaming down Jimmy's face. Can you tell us about one of these teenagers? Marcus was 16 when I met him, Robert said, his voice becoming infinitely tender. He'd been arrested for drug possession and told me that recovery was easy for me because I was Iron Man, but that nobody would give a junkie kid like him a second chance. Robert paused, gathering himself to continue with the same intensity he brought to his most important performances. Marcus carried the same shame about addiction that nearly killed me. The belief that using drugs meant he was fundamentally broken. Through our work together, Marcus learned that addiction is a disease, not a moral failing, and that recovery is possible even when you don't have superhero resources. What happened to Marcus? Jimmy asked through his tears. Marcus is now 25 and works as a peer counselor at a teen addiction center, Robert said with profound satisfaction. He tells kids that if Iron Man can get clean, so can they. But more importantly, he shows them that real-life recovery is possible through support, treatment, and the understanding that their worth isn't determined by their worst moments. The audience was openly emotional, many people crying as they witnessed this revelation about Robert's private work, saving young lives from addiction. Robert, how has this work changed your understanding of your own recovery? Jimmy asked. It's taught me that my second chance was meaningless unless I used it to create second chances for others, Robert replied with hard-won wisdom. These kids showed me that real heroism isn't about playing superheroes in movies. It's about showing up for people who are fighting for their lives against demons that society pretends don't exist. As the segment concluded, something unprecedented happened. The entire studio audience rose in sustained applause that lasted over 7 minutes. But it wasn't just appreciation for a performance. It was recognition of redemption transformed into rescue, acknowledgement that they had witnessed someone using his greatest failure to prevent others from failing. Robert's revelation became one of the most impactful Tonight Show segments in the program's history, inspiring conversations about teen addiction, the importance of recovery support, and the responsibility that comes with surviving your own destruction. Most importantly, Robert's disclosure had shown that sometimes the greatest superpower is not the ability to fly or shoot lasers, but the courage to reach back into the darkness you escaped and pull others toward the light, proving that true heroes are made not in fantasy worlds, but in the real world, one second chance at a time.